Good morning. The room looks different from down here. As Johnny just said, I'm on the board of directors for DigitalEd and one of the investors. And we wanted to open up a conversation with you today about something the working title, which is Mobius Collaborative. And this really speaks to a kind of higher purpose of Mobius, and that we're at this unique point in history where through the dynamics of a digital product and a digital platform, we're able to transform education. And how that will happen, and how we can make that happen for the best future for STEM learner outcomes and for educational institutions is a broad and complex question, but one that's important to ask and for us to seize this opportunity. And we wanted to, this morning, open up a dialogue with you on, from your perspective, if you have felt the need for this kind of dialogue, what are the potential areas of interest for inquiry. For example, yesterday, in Steve Farino's presentation, he talked about the need that we have for research, and could we possibly coordinate research across institutions to delve into some of the questions that you have. And in a sense, we have here a community of practice. And that community of practice can be, we can take advantage of that, so we can accelerate our learning, accelerate our effectiveness. That really does begin with you in the areas that you are interested in. So what I'm going to do is really take a few minutes now to set up the context, why we think this is the time to do this and to have this conversation. Then they'll take about 15 minutes. Then we're going to get you into small groups, which is why we're in this room versus the other room. So we'll have a facilitated discussion, hopefully time for a couple rounds of it. We're going to gather the input that you give us today, reflect on it, and use that to think about the path forward. Earlier today, Johnny spoke about the advisory and about the ideas group, and how this might integrate with that is yet to be determined. And it will depend on what we hear from you today. So I wanted to start with a modified version of this quote from Martin Luther King, with courage is taking a step when you cannot see the whole staircase. And in a sense, we have, it's where we are now with digital education, that we can see the first step, but what exactly lies beyond that, we cannot see. And with that, we really are at a once-in-a-lifetime tipping point in the adoption of STEM online, or STEM digital education and learning. In 1994-95, I was one of the co-founders of the business that was dedicated to examining what the implications of what we called at that point network interactive multimedia, or NIM, would be for the world, for industries, for end users. And we started that business in 1994, and in 1995, a product called Mosaic became Netscape, and we had the first visual browser. And because our business was positioned where it was, we were working with many of the technology, telecommunications, and manufacturing companies around the world. So in thinking through what this new thing called the web might be. And it's hard to believe this now, looking back at that point. But there was heated debate inside of companies like Apple, Microsoft, IBM, who were all clients of ours at that time, all of the large consulting firms that were also clients of ours at that time, about, well, is this web really anything new? Will it really have anything to do with business? Is it really just brochures online? Will it fundamentally change the dynamics of any industry? And no one really knew the answers to that at that time. I remember we used to put on private conferences, and we had at one of our conferences, one of the participants in the original committee that created the standards for the web and for the internet. And he said, you know, we were at the end of a meeting and we had come to a point where we created the .ca for Canada, .uk for the United Kingdom, as these would be conventions within the internet. And the meeting was adjourned, and we were just about to get up from the table, and someone put up their hand and said, you know what, maybe somebody's going to want to do business on this thing called the internet and called the web. Let's create a .com designation. And I could see that there's this period of fluidity as we move through the generations of technology that exists for a very short period of time. I'll give you another example. In the first 300 days of the web, I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, and our company was doing case studies on these emerging companies so that we could, in a sense, reverse engineer what was it that were essential dynamics to their success to bring it back to our client groups with the large corporations. And I spent, one of the businesses or companies I spent a lot of time with was Hotwire, which was the online version of Wired magazine. And it, as it turned out, established a lot of what are the conventions of the way that commercial sites look on the web today. So they were the first to have banner advertising. They were the first to say, you know what, we could support our content by creating advertising related to it. They were one of the first to really take what had been bulletin boards and say, what would this look like in a media setting? And I remember talking with the people within the business at that time, and they said, well, we want to have threaded discussion. Any content that we publish, we want our readers to be able to comment on it, to extend it. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the look and feel of their content as good as what we publish. And it was a small group. We could have, all of Hotwire at that time could have been at these tables here, and maybe a couple tables at that level. And it was this time of discovery. And that period, it seems, with technology tends to get shorter now, but it does exist. And our view is we're in that period now in digital education. That while it's been an idea that's been gaining momentum, we now have this convergence of social demand for it. We have a generation that expects it. We have parents that expect it. We have now the technology rising to a level that will support it. And I'll just give you a parallel example. In 2017, the human threshold for acceptable voice-to-text recognition is 95%. And Google voice recognition hit that 95% threshold, its AI threshold in 2017. So we see in many different parts of technology, we're hitting this tipping point where a number of forces are coming together that make digital education land at a level that it hasn't landed before. But with that, there's something that that I call the sixth row syndrome. And this is a dynamic in technology that repeats itself. And that is that we tend to use new technology with the mindset and approaches of the previous generation of the technology. And to me, the best example of that is this. When the moving pictures were invented, and we had cameras that could capture motion, couldn't capture sound yet, but could capture motion, here's how they were used to create the first films that people saw. They would get the actors to be in the film, to be on a proscenium stage. They would go into a theater, they'd take out the center seat in the sixth row, which is generally considered to be the best seat in the house, and they'd put a camera there. And then they'd shoot the film. So if you look at very early dramatic films in the silent film era, they were very static because they were saying, well, we've got theater, so we're going to do film as if it was theater, because that's the mindset that they had. And so that's one of the challenges that we have as we develop digital assets for use in the education process. An example of that yesterday was in Dennis's, not of this syndrome, but actually of seeing what new technology could afford us that we might not see otherwise. He talked about how in his use in teaching, he's able to get visibility into the learner's process. Not just seeing the outcomes of their answer to the question, but what was the logic train that they went through. And that's something that we have not had visibility into previously. So what opportunities does that open up to us? So we feel that there's a potential by opening a dialogue across institutions that we can begin to identify earlier the ways in which this new technology can be used to enhance the learner experience. My whole career has been focused on applied learning theory to both the public sector and private sector. And building high-performance organizations. And what is at the heart of building high-performance organizations and businesses is the ability to sense and respond to your environment and to organize within an organizational context that response. And key to that is feedback. The closer you can have feedback to the act of trying something new to see what the consequences can be, the more you can accelerate the pace of learning. And when we, as investors, looked at Mobius to get involved in it, we saw that there was this transformative, perhaps for the first time in hundreds of years of the education, approach to education, that we can start to bring to bear a very powerful dynamic in the learning process, which is to link very closely feedback on the learner's process to the moment at which they learn. And we also know, and Steve was talking about this yesterday, in terms of experiential learning, that learning is an engaged process. That when the learner is connected through, we can shorten the distance between when we are exposed to a new concept, a new idea, and the ability to explore it and then test our knowledge. How did I do? Is that button. Then we can start to more quickly embed that learning in the learner's experience and improve it. So there's this potential for really new ways of coming at it. Now, I thought since we were here in Denmark that I'd go to another field of practice to show someone who in the field of architecture and design is really in some respects revolutionizing how we think about buildings. And Bjork Ingalls is his name. And I wanted just to show you what someone can do when they start to think about design in very different ways. So new materials allow new opportunities within the field of architecture. This was his first project when he was 30 years old. We reset the stage for Bjarke and subsequent work he would do. This is the Children's Boathouse here in Copenhagen. And when he applied for this and competed for this design, the bulk of the very limited budget, the bulk of the budget was for remediation. They had to do soil removal. Bjarke thought, well, maybe we don't remove the soil. What we do is we just build a platform on top of it. And with that platform, it doesn't have to be flat. We can use that platform to really, in a sense, replicate what might be sand dunes coming down to the water and provide a much more flexible space. Roll the camera ahead 10 years later, and here is one of Bjarke's buildings built in a prime, one of the last prime large building sites in New York City. It's called West 57th. And his building also extends out over the Hudson River. But this building is a very new way of envisioning a lived environment. It's mixed residential commercial. So working with the same materials that are available to many, are all architects and all designers, he has come up with really revolutionary ways of thinking about the process of building. And the last is here. This is a building, a view in Copenhagen of the power plant. And the power plant is where they use materials, waste materials to generate power. The only emission into the atmosphere is steam. And Bjarke and his company came up with the idea, you see that large building on the upper left that slopes down. He suggested, well, why don't we make this, it looks like a mountain, we have a very flat country, let's put a ski hill on it. So it's in the process of being installed now. There's going to be a 300-foot ski hill here in Copenhagen on the top of a utility building that's a power generation station. So he combined two ideas, and with that opened up possibilities that didn't exist previously. And I just use this by analogy, by metaphor, to say, as we work with Mobius, as we move forward with digital assets in the education process, it's important that we not think about it with that sixth row syndrome. That our organizing concept in our brain not be that we're taking a textbook and we have to mirror the textbook, or we have to mirror the classroom as it's existed for hundreds of years. And I don't know what the answers to any of that is, and it is a process of discovery. And our view is if we can discover that together, we can do it better. There's another element of technology, which is unintended consequences. What we see again, if we look back since 1995 to today, is with each generation of technology and products, that initially it's a period of all of the good things it's going to do. So we take social media as an example, and think of how social media, and it was cited quite often during the period what was called the Arab Spring, how social media was enabled a social organization and movements that had never been possible. Flash mobs, flash groups were the examples of that. Or we think of Mark Zuckerberg recently at the US Congress, and to paraphrase one part of what he said to them, he said, as a company, we were perhaps over-idealistic and over-optimistic. That was a character of our company. All of the good things that Facebook would bring to the world. And only recently have we seen in terms of manipulation of the democratic process, some of the unintended consequences of it. So even as we move forward with digital assets, the question in our minds is, are there unintended consequences? How can we be alert to those weak signals of what the unintended consequences might be? One of the unintended consequences we see now already for something that this generation will yet to be named, but one name for it is the I generation. And that's people born between 1995 and about 2010. And there's been longitudinal studies of teenagers, and this is the US based, teenagers in the US since 1975, every year, just slips my mind the organization that does this, that goes through and tests the patterns and the social psychological well-being of teenagers every year. And what we see in the I generation is that with their immersion in social media, that they now spend 40% less time face-to-face with their peers than if you just roll the camera back 8-9 years ago. With that, what we also see is a rise in depression, a rise in a feeling of isolation, and a rise of anxiety. And so far, in these longitudinal studies, in terms of intervention, the only factor that seems to run counter to those trends among that generation is face-to-face time with their peers. So the more that they can be in actual person-to-person contact, the more these characteristics, and it's almost a public health or epidemiological issue, starts to decrease. So that would be, for example, one of the things we need to be aware of as we move forward. There's times where a pure online environment makes sense, but with that, what are the unintended consequences that come with it? I recall recently looking at a paper published by came out of a university in the Middle East, where they replaced all of their courses by online courses, and they wanted to know the results of that. Now, in that case, they were doing it because there was a revolution going on in the country, and it was a conflict zone, and for just pure safety reasons, they couldn't gather their students in one place. So they went purely online. Their assessment was there was no issues, no degrading of student outcomes, but that's in that context. One of the other papers I saw recently showed that in highly technical subject areas, STEM, that the performance outcomes for compared groups from traditional education mode to online mode, there was no difference. So it's a nuanced question. It's context specific. And again, is how can we, as we move through this process together, use one another as a resource and to answer some of these questions, because many of the questions we don't even know what they will be yet. The last point I want to make is that by doing this, we're doing more than just building the success, the efficacy of our own institutions, our own universities, that is contributing to the field of education. And at its broadest level, at a time when the world seems to be moving away from any ability to dialogue globally, to be much more atomized, to be much more suspicious, where facts are becoming anything that you might want them to be, where the advances of the Enlightenment, humanism, rationalism, seems in some respects to be degrading, under threat. That in a sense the only universal language on the planet right now is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It doesn't matter the culture that you're in, it doesn't matter the language that you speak, that the conventions of STEM are the one common language around the world. We also need STEM in the world to speak to some of the major issues that we face. Health-related issues, environmental, climate change, food, very fundamental issues that we face as the world going forward, that STEM has a place in it. So while our group here is small, roll the camera back to 1995 in San Francisco, the groups in those companies were small and had an enormous impact on them. And we have at least the opportunity to be a voice in how STEM education unfolds as we move forward. So what are some of the lines of inquiry and dialogue? Well, this morning we were diving deep into the product itself. There's the coordinated research and inquiry that we can have around, let's move one more forward here, accelerating effective courseware development and deployment. And how can we use the functionalities and features of a digital environment to enhance the learning experience. There's creating optimal mixes of pure play, digital-based learning, and some kind of blended approach. There's a very complex area which is building institutional support as we move forward. And as it came out earlier this morning, where some universities have large groups dedicated, they're committed as institutions to move into the space. For some, it's individual instructors. For some, it's really at the nation level where we need to influence policy. We have this whole the analytics and their value, and the value of real-time feedback and learning experience, which plays into the design of individual courses, to take it up to the level of curriculum, and from there to resource management at an institutional level. To be able to see, we'll have analytics and visibility into the effectiveness of individual modules, not just of individual courses. And with that, we can envision new futures for learning. We probably yet don't appreciate the extent that this is going to be disruptive to universities and to the learning process. But we have a chance to manage that and to build momentum that allows us, because what we can control is what happens in our institutions, to be the most effective that we can be as we get further and further into this area. So what we're going to ask you to do now is to have a group discussion. I'm just going to set that up in a minute. In a moment, I'm going to ask you if we've got tables that seat 4. So if you're not at a table that seats 4, I'm going to ask you in a moment to move to a table. And then we're going to have about a 15-minute discussion. I'm going to give you a couple of questions in a moment. And then we're going to, we'll gather up your input from that first round of discussion. We're going to switch tables a bit, and we're going to have another round of discussion. And it can be at any of these levels that I'm outlining here, or there should be in the last bullet point should be other. There might be another area that you want to delve into. In a sense, I'm asking you to pull back from that deeper dive we were doing on the product and the details of it to that wider view of the learning process and how Mobius and digital assets plays into your institutions, can play into the wider society. So this is the two questions we'd like you to consider when you're in your groups. but to advance the optimal value of digital STEM learning in your institution. First of all, what are the gaps or key questions you have? Because we at DigitalEd, we can have a better sense of that. That helps us direct our resources and how we can support you in that inquiry and how we can engage best with you. And then secondly, and this goes to the idea of, at this point they might put weak signals because we're still relatively early stage. But what new innovative ways can we be using this product to enhance the learning experience? And also, do you see any indicators of unintended consequences? It's still early days, but it would be good to identify those. So if you would just organize yourself. The other thing I would suggest, if there's more than one of you from one university here, that you split up and go to different tables. So if you would just get into tables of 4 now and talk about these 2 questions for the next 15 minutes, and at the end of that I'll give you instructions for the next step. So what we're going to do now for the last about 7 or 8 minutes is ask you to synthesize the discussion that you've had so far. And you'll see we've given you 5 post-it notes on each table and a marker. And what we want you to do now is as a group, reflect on the discussion that you've had and identify what are 3 to 5 areas of inquiry that arose in your discussion that are most pressing or interesting. So let me give you an example of what that might be, just using what we just checked in with you a few minutes ago. So one of the ideas of interest was the notion of could we create a generic product, simple product, which we give access to refugees who are now not getting access, and it's critical to the integration, social well-being, that they have an opportunity to be educated as well, and in STEM as an element of that, and aimed at age 5 to 14 in English. So what you could do is you talk about that. Really, if you think of, if you go up a logical level, what that's speaking to is this potential of digital assets, of a platform that could be accessed anytime, anywhere, to extend STEM learning to populations that don't have it, wouldn't have access to it otherwise. So that's how you might say, as a further area of inquiry, we'd like to focus on how we might develop a product or a sub-product that could be used to extend access to STEM education. That's how you would capture that on the post-it note. So what we'd like you to do is you've got 5, you can put 3 to 5 ideas that came up, that areas you'd like to see further inquiry, where there might be collaborative inquiry across colleges and universities. And put one idea, just one idea on each post-it note. And the idea is not a single word, but not a paragraph. So something that captures the essence of that discussion. So is that relatively clear? Okay, so I'll turn it back to you. I'll give you a shout out when we've got about a minute left, and I'll tell you about the next steps from here. If I could just have your attention for a moment. If you want to spend a few more minutes before you go grab some lunch, just to finish this off, that would be great. You can leave your post-it notes, but if you've completed it, you can just leave them at your table. Over lunch, we'll collect them. We'll sort them, we'll theme them on the board, and then when we come back from lunch, we'll just spend a few minutes saying, here's the themes that came out, here's some of the areas as well, and invite you as you come back from lunch to just come up and have a look at the range of areas of interest that have been identified. And then we will be taking pictures of all of these. We will do just a complete just straight write-up of them. And then we're going to have a team meeting back at DigitalEd in the next week to think about what's the best way to move forward, given what you told us today, and how best we can support these lines of inquiry.